I'm very excited to welcome you for tonight's talk, and I would like to also welcome you on behalf of the whole Center for Buddhist Studies at Stanford University. I'm very excited. Today we have Professor Bryan Lowe from Princeton University, and he gives a talk on his current book project, and I will talk more about that in a second. He's assistant professor in religious studies at Princeton University, and he specializes in Buddhism of ancient Japan. And his ritual areas are very much also dear to, I think, most of our research areas, like ritual studies, manuscript studies, historiography, canons, Buddhist canons, and also religions of non-elite people in ancient Japan. And his first book, Ritualized Writing, which is here, Buddhist Practice and Scriptural Culture in Ancient Japan. And you saw lots of notes from myself. It's a very fascinating book, and many of you, our PhD students, have read it. I think in my class when I taught recent readings in Japanese Buddhism, we read actually this book too, and we were all very much excited for it because it's a very fascinating studies about rituals, ritual practices, about scribal cultures in ancient Japan, about the canon, how canon was developed in our period, about the materiality, about the papers used, paper production, what papers to use for the scriptural copying, as well as also about the whole social network surrounding scribal cultures in our period. It's a very, very fascinating book. I think if you have not read it, I would highly recommend to read it. It also really got the John Whitney Hall Book Prize of the Association of Asian Studies because it's really a groundbreaking work talking about scriptural cultures in ancient Japan. And his current book project now, still in ancient Japan, but now it turns to how Buddhism spread from the capital to more the local areas. Also again, talking about elite and non-elite cultures and how they intermingled, and he really challenges the dichotomy of these two different groups and how they actually interrelate. And I'm very excited that he will introduce a part of this new book project today about temple building from the 17th to 7th to 9th century in ancient Japan. Yeah, very much welcome. Please join me and welcome Professor Bryan Lowe for today's talk.
Thank you so much, Michaela. That was such a generous introduction. I'm very nervous that I see all those Post-it notes in the book that they're filled with things like wrong, fool, so it's a little intimidating. But the one thing I will say about that book, which was not by my own choosing, but I'm very happy Stephanie Chun from the University of Hawaii Press chose the color of the book, that purple shade, which I really has grown on me over the years, and it's nice to see the purple, even if the contents might not live up to the cover. I want to thank Michaela for inviting me, Irene for organizing the talk, as well as Leah and Stephanie and all the people that supported and made this possible. It's been incredibly well organized. It's a delight to be in Stanford. I've never been here before. It's a beautiful campus. It started out rainy, but the sun came out. It feels like California. So it's just really great to be here. So I want to start my talk not in sunny California, but in an equally wonderful place, Chiba. Chiba is in eastern Japan, just east of Tokyo. And if you go to Chiba today, you might think of it as a land of magic and adventure. You might even call it an enchanted place. It is, after all, the home to Mickey Mouse in the misnamed Tokyo Disneyland, which is not in Tokyo, but in Chiba. And I was joking before this talk started that my best slide and the highlight of my talk happens way too early. You should really kind of have the climax of your talk come much later. And I kind of structured poorly. So this is really the peak, and it's kind of downhill from here. Chiba, however, was not always a hopping place like this. An 11th century diarist described this area as, quote, the back of beyond. I love that expression, the back of beyond. She reflected on how someone like her who grew up there, in what was known then as Kazusa, would have been considered, quote, rustic and odd by those in the capital. Chiba, for most of pre-modern Japanese history, was something of a backwater. At least that's how it was imagined in the eyes of those at the court. We might then not expect to find much Buddhism in Chiba, right in this backwater. In fact, if we were to look at the archaeological evidence for temples in Kazusa, which is a part of Chiba, in the year 650 CE, about 100 years after Buddhism first enters Japan, this is what we discover right here. The slide that you're looking at right now contains all of the temples in Kazusa. Do you see them? You're not mistaken. You don't have to get a new prescription. You don't have to squint. There are none. There were no temples in the year 650, 100 years after Buddhism enters Japan. And so you might be, perhaps, at this point, blissfully hoping that this is the end of the talk. A temple, a temple in every village, like, hell no, there weren't any in the whole province, right? It's a short talk. We can move on to dinner and wine. But if you'll bear with me just for a moment, if I were to fast forward in kind of the history of Kazusa, I'm going to let this slide cycle through as I talk repeatedly. So I know it's moving very fast, but I kind of want to demonstrate how quickly things change. So I'll kind of walk you through this for a minute. So this is the next 175 years, basically. So first, starting at the beginning of the 7th century, we have these two diamond-shaped stations. These are highway stations. So one of the things that happens right at this time is a nationwide highway system is constructed that contains as many kilometers of highways as the present highway system in Japan contains, excluding the island of Hokkaido. So massive infrastructure project, right? Like Biden had infrastructure kind of week that kind of went on for a long time a couple years ago. This was like infrastructure decades in Japan. Then we start to have these blue temples emerge. These blue temples are what I'm going to call kind of first stage temples. These are really built in the last quarter of the 7th century mostly, and are increasing rapidly in numbers from this time. Then in the mid-8th century, in a second, right there, we have two red dots appear. These are what are known as the kokubunji. These are officially state-sponsored temples. These are the most famous ones, but they're a very small part of the picture, as you see. And then finally, from the end of the 7th century, from the end of the 8th century into the early 9th century, these yellow dots appear. These are temples that are known in Japanese as sonraku-jin or sonraku-nai-jin, village temples. And these are temples that are appearing that are very, very humble spaces of worship, where you wouldn't even necessarily recognize them as a temple architecturally. They have thatched roof, they're simple earth-fast post-construction, but they seem to have been centers of Buddhist worship. And so over the talk today, I want to outline, we'll return to Kazusa later, I want to return and kind of tell the story of how these temples came to be. If we zoom out a bit and look at the macro data, so that's kind of a micro view. If we look at, I like to do macro and micro in my first book too. I have micro histories and I have kind of macro histories. If we look at the macro perspective, we can see that texts tell us that in the year 624, there were only 46 temples in all of Japan. And these, we know from archaeological sources, are almost all, and possibly even exclusively, in the region around the capital, what is known as the Kinai region, the provinces immediately surrounding the capitals, I should say. The capitals are moving in Japan at this time. A 12th century source, the Fusoryaki, the abbreviated Chronicle of Japan, states that there were 545 temples by the year 692. So this is a 15-fold increase in 70 years, less than 70 years. Now, we might be suspicious of a 12th century source, right, to tell us about 7th century temples, and rightly so. But what's amazing and kind of shocking to me is, if anything, this seems to be a conservative estimate. Archaeologists have found more than 700 temples by the first decades of the 8th century. So if we get within like 2 decades from this, the number's already up at 700 by archaeological data. So this is a huge growth in Japan at this time. Fast forward again to 838 when we next have a textual record that gives us a number. This is an Ennin's diary. And in Ennin's diary, he records a conversation with a Chinese official when his companion Ensai claims that there were 3,700 monasteries in Japan and, quote, many nunneries. He doesn't say how many. They ask, how many nunneries are there? He's like, oh, there are a lot of those. So I have 3,700 plus. This number by Reischauer is considered like an exaggeration. And most scholars assumed it was an exaggeration until quite recently. But Yoshikawa Shinji, a scholar from Kyoto University, has posited based on archaeological evidence that this number might be plausible after all. And I'll return to this in the talk, but I agree that I think the number might be a little bit inflated, but we're certainly talking about thousands of temples by the time we get to the 9th century. And these temples that are emerging in the 9th century are very, very humble structures. So in this talk today, what I want to do is argue that between the late 7th and the early 9th century, Japan changed from a land without Buddhism to a country where Buddhist ideas, images, and practices were everywhere. I'll suggest that a new religious order emerged, one that brought this foreign religion to the vast majority of the Japanese population for the first time, and one that forever transformed the social and intellectual life of the provinces, an area that I'm defining as everywhere from Kyushu to northeastern Honshu, excluding the Kinai region, excluding these provinces surrounding the capital. From this time, people began to see the world in new ways, imagining previously inconceivable possibilities for themselves in this life and the next. This was arguably the most dramatic religious transformation in the history of Japan. But the story has largely gone unnoticed. There are a lot of historiographical reasons for why this story has gone unnoticed. I'm going to have to gloss over them. My original version of this talk, when I rehearsed it, was like running like an hour and a half, and I had to cut a lot. So historiography, if you're interested in, something I can return to. But I want to offer two representative quotations that I think show how surprising my findings might be. And I chose like really prominent like scholars, prominent like men, because I figured like they're good people to target. But I like really respect both of these scholars' work, but I think kind of in this case, they get the narrative of the early history of Japanese Buddhism wrong, which is understandable because almost everyone has gotten it wrong, I think. So Michael Como, dear mentor and colleague of mine, one of my favorite people in the field, wrote, although no one can doubt the influence of Nara period Buddhism on Japanese religious history, there is nonetheless little evidence that Buddhist cultic practices dominated religious life in the countryside. Now, dominated is admittedly a strong word, so maybe we could quibble, and at the end of my talk, you'd say, well, it didn't necessarily dominate. We probably can never know if something dominated religious life, but the general sense you get from this quote is that, like, in the provinces outside of the capital, Buddhist cultic practices, Buddhist ritual life and worship didn't seem to play a major role. Mikhail Allison from Cambridge University, little if any Buddhist ideology reached the common people in early Japan, despite the evangelizing efforts of mendicants such as Gyoki in the mid-8th century. So here we have the idea that the common people had little exposure to Buddhism. And interestingly, the only exception is Gyoki. This is like an aside, I won't get into this in the talk, but Gyoki actually played no role in spreading Buddhism to the provinces. There's no evidence that Gyoki was active outside of the Kinai region of the capital. So it's kind of funny because whenever anyone tries to say Buddhism spread more widely, the only example they cite is Gyoki, but that's actually the wrong example. And so even when we start to get a hint that there might be more going on, we actually tell the story incorrectly. So in my talk, I want to respond by outlining 3 stages of temple construction. The first is happening from 650 to 740, but really especially kind of between 675 and the very beginning of the 8th century. And in this period, we have local elites, I want to argue, as the main actors driving this production of temples, but that they're doing so as bridges connecting capital culture and the countryside. So they're doing it tied into networks with the capital. The second stage is the one that's the most famous, which is a center kind of driven, a project to build temples in every province, commanded by imperial edict. But I want to kind of reverse this and say, although it is clearly a state project, it also in some ways is tied to local culture on the ground and local networks. And then the third is drawing on a sociological metaphor for how we think about networks and how ideas spread. I'm going to argue that densely interconnected networks in the late 8th and early 9th century allowed the construction of these village temples on a large-scale level, these much humbler structures of worship. So that's the talk today. The book, you're basically getting chapters 1 through 3 in abbreviated form. I'm glossing over. It's going to be a very superficial version of my book. There are a lot more case studies and examples in the book, but I'm just going to give kind of basically 3 examples during the talk, kind of 1 for each chapter. But the other thing I want to stress is the second half of this book tells the rest of the story, which is really important. What I'm not going to be able to tell you in this talk today is like, why did people find Buddhist ideas attractive? What convinced them to want to build temples in the first place? And to understand that, I think we really have to pay attention to preachers and what they are preaching about. Things that Ralph is very interested in, and I have to apologize for. I tried to squeeze this into the talk too, and it just wasn't happening. But that's an important part of the story of preaching and the messages that are being communicated to provincial audiences. But again, we'll have to save that for Q&A. So without further ado of introduction, let's just dive right into the first stage. So to rehash, I've already kind of explained this, so I'll just go quickly. The first stage is temples built really in the last half of the 7th century, but especially the final quarter. Japanese archaeologists usually divide things into quarters, so 25-year periods. As I've shown you, there seem to have been about 545 temples by textual sources and 700 plus by archaeological data. And what's really important in this period is for the first time we have temples everywhere in the provinces. So every single province in Japan, except those of southwestern Kyushu, which is not really a part of the Japanese, one could say empire, perhaps that's provocatively, or part of Japan at this time, outside of southwestern Kyushu, every single province in Japan actually has at least one of these temples by the end of the period we're looking. So it's a massive geographic spread. This growth is roughly concurrent with the construction of a large-scale highway system. There's something else I'm not going to talk about as much, but these temples often tend to line highways and are usually very close to stations. So oftentimes highway kind of rest stations will have a temple within like a kilometer or so of them. The actors, though, who were building these temples, although they benefited from the state-constructed highway, the actors who are commissioning these temples seem to have been local provincial elites on the ground. How have Japanese scholars, who are the main people who have looked at this, classified these temples? Well, the oldest kind of model that we have, and one that is actually making a comeback, and I'm supporting the comeback, is what we can call a clan or a kinship temple, an uji-dera. Scholars that take this position emphasize that these temples were often built near burial mounds, near kofun, for powerful kinship groups. In doing so, these scholars claim that these temples basically kind of took on the function of performing memorial ritual for these families. And indeed, we have some stelae that record people building temples for the purpose of memorial ritual. And we have a lot of stories from this time that describe temples being constructed for memorial ritual. So we have a shift where people stop building burial mounds and start building temples. These scholars, and again, I'm in this camp, highlight the agency of the provincial gentry. That's actually a term I've stopped using. It's still on the slide. I basically was using it before because some classic kind of sinological works had used it. And then I realized people criticized the use of gentry as being too Eurocentric, and now I kind of stopped using it too. But provincial elites. The other model that kind of gained traction is to treat these as being in some ways more tied to state apparatuses. So the earlier terminology was district temples, and these saw these basically as kind of district-level government offices. We realized that this was not a good view because most district offices didn't necessarily have these. There was really no evidence that they were tied to government institutions. And so scholars started using different language saying, it's a very cumbersome phrase, gunga shuhen jin, so district office adjacent temples, to mean that these are temples that are near these district offices. These scholars have emphasized the location of the temples being built near government offices. District offices, I should say, provincial administration. This will come up a few times in this talk. Provincial administration is divided into provincial offices, which are staffed by people appointed from the capital who are dispatched out into the provinces. And then district offices, which is a more local level, which is staffed by local elites. So people have emphasized the location of these temples are built near these district offices. They've pointed to a few passages in court chronicles that say, hey, there were some rituals being performed in the provinces. They probably were taking place at these district temples, although we don't have any direct evidence of this. And they've really highlighted kind of centralized planning, looking at an edict that says that there should be Buddha homes built throughout the provinces as evidence for this. The evidence for this position, in my view, is a little bit thin, but there does seem to be at least some connection at these sites, these early temples, some connections to the state. What that is a little bit vague. So what I want to kind of ask, and the way I want to approach this, is what happens when we stop thinking of this as a binary, as an either or, but rather thinking about these temples as kind of connected, playing multiple roles, and being parts of larger networks. So to illustrate this, I want to show kind of what I think is one of the best cases of this, which is this temple known as Mirokuji in present-day Gifu Prefecture. This would be Mino no Kuni. Back then, you see, with the time difference when I did my search, which was probably during the daytime in America, it was closed. But this is just a Google map to give you a sense. The early capitals are going to be kind of in this area. So Nara is the capital for the 8th century. This temple slightly predates the Nara capital. But out at the kind of foothills of what it becomes a very mountainous area of Gifu, up here. This temple is not recorded in any textual accounts. We have no textual records of this temple at all. But we have a rich archaeological record. And just to give you a sense, these are just some pictures I took from visiting the site. We have things ranging from can anyone, and there's a label here, but can anyone identify what this is? It's the curl of the Buddha's hair, right? So you can see like the Buddha's hair. So we don't have the Buddha statue, but we have like fragments of like the Buddha's curls, like the Buddha's locks that fell off, right? We have pottery inscribed with words like pagoda or temple. And then we have the archaeological features. So this is the place where the pagoda would have been. And you can see where like the main pillar in the center and also kind of the surrounding construction was built that has been kind of excavated by archaeologists. So when we put this all together, the temple kind of looks like this. This is, sorry, just like a picture of a reconstructed painting from like right outside the site. But you would walk in through a central gate. There's actually a southern gate a little further below. You would walk in through a central gate. Here is the golden hall. This is the main object of worship would be housed here. That's where the Buddha's curls would be coming from. You have a pagoda, a lecture hall, and then behind it these aren't labeled, but probably a sutra repository and a belfry. That's usually kind of how these temples are laid out. Relatively small scale structure, but at the same time something that really would have been like impressive, right? If we imagine this temple from the eyes of inhabitants of Mino province at this time, they would have never seen anything like it, right? Almost everything would have seemed exotic. There would be a towering building, right, a pagoda, an imposing long-eared deity, men with shaved heads burning incense and chanting strange-sounding texts. This was a new religious world, a new sensory world, a new ritual world, a new cosmology that would have, and new architecture that would have entered their lives for the first time. Now nothing is left. If you go to the site, this is what it looks like. It's bamboo groves and fields with a few labels telling us where buildings were. What's interesting to me, though, is to think about the building's position. So first of all, it's on a river, it's on a waterway, and there's a branch road over here that would have connected to one of the major highway systems. The Kurihara Motazu, the car repair and maintenance shop, did not date to the 8th century. That came sometime after Henry Ford. I'm not sure exactly. I haven't looked into the history of this institution yet. But what's interesting here, and I'll show you a map with English labels in a second, this is where the temple would be. These are burial mounds, and these are the government offices. And this is what it looks like today. These are just some of my snapshots. And you can see then quite literally, right, this temple sits between the kofun, the burial mounds, and the district offices. Mirokuji's position then wedged between the Ikejiri Otsuka burial mounds to its west and the district offices to its east reveals problems in classifying this temple in terms of kinship or district. The temple's location next to the burial mounds is by no means unique. This is like a really, really common place to build these temples, and as I mentioned before, it marks this transition in ritual culture. The Mugetsu kinship group, who we know is the prominent family in this area from other textual records, they were the probable sponsors of both the burial mound and of the temple. The district offices are interesting because they actually postdate the temple. And this is one of the reasons that scholars have come recently to reject the district office adjacent temple, that's so hard to say, district office adjacent temple thesis, is because in a lot of cases the district offices seem to have been built after the fact, after the temples. But what's interesting here, and I don't quite understand the way that the archaeologists make this claim, but it seems like the site was cleared at the same time. So even though the district offices themselves slightly postdate the temples, it seems like from the beginning there was a plan to build this together as a set. So we see that these temples in some ways, at least in terms of their location, are simultaneously playing multiple roles at once, right? Mirokuji was neither purely kinship nor purely state. It visually bridges the local kinship interests with those of the court. And when we look at the at the Mugetsu, the family that probably are the likely sponsors of this temple. Now again, the evidence we have that they're the likely sponsors, that they were the big shots in town that would have had the resources to build this temple. But if we look at the Mugetsu, we can see in other ways how they themselves are kind of bridging local political power and the political power of the capital. So the roof tile designs are based on this temple, Kawara-dera. It's the same, you can see it's the same pattern. And the tile, it's likely that the craftsmen would have been dispatched from the capital to the provinces using their molds from the capital to build these roof tiles. And the way it's really interesting how they look at the molds. This is like a whole subfield of Japanese archaeology. But you can see, like, as you reuse molds multiple times, right, the mold will start to get, damage, cracks and stuff in it. And so you can start to see those in the roof tiles growing over time, so you can know the order of how things happened and how they were built. So Kawada-dera roof tiles are dispatched to this place Midokuji. Now, why is that happening, and what do we know about this temple, Kawada-dera? So Kawada-dera was a temple that was first initiated by Emperor Tenji, who reigned from 668 to 672, but completed by his brother, Emperor Tenmu, who reigned from 673 to 686. And this is the time when this temple, Midokuji, was built as well, kind of at the end of Tenmu's reign, or sometime in the middle of Tenmu's reign, roughly. The Mugetsu family had a close relationship with Tenmu that facilitated this technological exchange. One figure from the Mugetsu kinship group, Mugetsu no Kimihiro, served Tenmu and was ordered back to his home province of Mino to help raise troops for the impending Jinshin rebellion through which Tenmu claimed the throne. So Tenmu gets the throne through like a military kind of conquest, and the Mugetsu were dispatched from the capital back home to raise troops from their own power base to support Tenmu. So we can see then that the access to these roof tiles likely came from this privilege that they gained through serving Tenmu. And we also know that Tenmu granted them estates to help provide financial support that would enable them to do things like build these temples. So the Mugetsu then were able to use their connection with the throne to introduce Buddhist architecture and ritual to the region. It was precisely then because these individuals acted as bridges between the capital and their home territories that temples simultaneously served more than one role at once, be it kinship or state. To see them as either kinship temples or district office adjacent temples is to miss the point. They literally connected the world of the early 8th century and late 7th century state and provincial family power. These temples then were neither one or the other, but rather parts of larger networks of service and transportation between capital and countryside. There's a lot more I could say, but let's go to the next moment of this talk. So, Kokobunji marked the second stage of temple construction. The Kokobunji project ordered that a paired monastery and nunnery would be built in every province, so 68 pairs total, and that they'd be staffed by 20 monks and 10 nuns. The number of nuns actually goes up under one of the female rulers later, but initially 20 monks and 10 nuns. There's also an order that there will be a 7-story pagoda at each site, at the monastery of each site, and a common ritual calendar throughout. Now we know that at almost all of these sites, the 7-story pagoda seems to have been built. And these would be like truly impressive structures. Just to give you a sense, at this time in Japan, it's not actually clear if there were any 7-story pagodas anywhere. There had been one at a temple that moves around a lot, and they might have either been building two at the temple Daianji at this time, or had just kind of torn down an old pagoda and were about to build the new one. But maybe, if anything, there were like 2 pagodas this size when this project starts, and then Todaiji has 2 as well that are 7-story. So these would be, like nothing people had ever seen before unless they had traveled to the capital, which people had, and I can talk about that more later. So this is like an impressive project, and to be able to build these nationwide is like absolutely amazing and kind of mind-boggling. And a lot of people kind of assumed that these weren't built, but then the archaeological record tells us indeed they seem to have been. So the project was initiated in 741 by edict from Emperor Shomu, which was in response to kind of a lot of threats the court was feeling, like epidemics that killed like up to a third of the population of Japan at this time, including a lot of prominent figures, and a rebellion that had kind of threatened the rulership. Although Emperor Shomu issued the edict, most scholars think that his chief consort Komyo likely proposed it, and in fact in her kind of obituary in the Shokunihongi, it credits her with this project. At these temples, state protection ritual was performed regularly. So things, for example, like reciting the Golden Light Sutra once a month. These types of rituals were performed regularly. But, and here's where I want to start to kind of complicate how we think about these sites. They also performed memorial rituals not only for successive emperors, but also for Komyoshi herself and for Komyoshi's Fujiwara ancestors, who, these are non-royals, that are Komyo's father was a Fujiwara, and Shomu's mother was actually also a Fujiwara, but performing ancestral rituals for the Fujiwara at the Kokobunji. And so this suggests in some ways, we can think of these temples as a nationwide version of the first stage temples, right? It's a nationwide version of temples to perform memorial rituals in addition to doing other acts as well. And the way I want to understand these temples, these second stage temples, is as an inverse. of the first stage temples. So while the first stage temples were led by local actors but required cooperation with the court, these temples, I want to suggest, were led by the center but necessitated support from the periphery. One of the ways we can see this, I think, is thinking about the diversity of the temples on the ground. So as I said, every single temple had a 7-story pagoda. So you might think like, oh, these are pretty uniform, right? If I were to build nationwide temples, I would have to give them all like roughly the same architectural plan and just send people out and do it. But when we look at these sites, they're remarkably different. They're different in their scale. They're like drastically different sizes. They use different roof tiles, like really, really different roof tile modes. There's like a whole host of patterns, and they're really diverse in their layouts. So I'm just going to show, I'm not going to talk about all of those aspects, I'm just going to focus on the layouts. But if we start in Tamba, Hyogo Prefecture, we can see everything is inside that compound. This is kind of like at Midokuji, right? Everything is inside this compound, and it's pretty cramped, right? We have the Golden Hall to the left, the pagoda to the right, a lecture hall behind, and a dormitory, all there. If we move to Sagami in eastern Japan, we can see that the Golden Hall and pagoda are still inside, but they've been flip-flopped, right, left to right. The lecture hall is moved back to be even with the corridor, and the dormitory is outside altogether. If we then move to Chikuzen in Kyushu, the only thing inside the corridor is the pagoda. The Golden Hall is where the lecture hall, I'm saying it's moved, but actually these are all being built concurrently. This isn't happening like over time. These are all being built at the same time, roughly. And then if we go to Harima, which is right near Tamba, it's a completely different layout where there's nothing inside. The pagoda is actually outside of the compound, and the only thing that is kind of close to being inside is the Golden Hall, which connects to the corridors. So we have these drastically different layouts, and these aren't all. I just showed 4 because I don't want to have overkill. But the Japanese scholar Ariga Yuji has identified 10 different layouts solely based on the corridor, lecture hall, pagoda, and Golden Hall. If we start to look at positions of the dormitories, we can add even more distinct layouts. So this is not like a uniformly built project. It really seems to respond to conditions on the ground. So why? Why was this the case? Why would a centrally planned project have such little consistency in its size, layout, and architecture? I want to argue that the discrepancies across provinces are an expected result of a system that relied heavily on local administration and financial support. In one of the places we see this is an edict, and I apologize, this will be my most text-heavy slide of my presentation. This edict from 747, 6 years after the temple was vowed, illuminates how the throne sought to recruit aid from district officials. Again, the district officials are the locally appointed people who are already based in the provinces, not the provincial offices. And I think the reason they had to rely on these district officials, as we see in this edict, is because the people appointed from the capital were not getting the job done. So I'm excerpting from this edict. I cut out a few places because it was pretty long, but here's the gist of it. Back on the 14th day of the 7th month in Tempio 13, 741, I, Shomu, it's presumptuous, I feel, I, Shomu, I, the Emperor of Japan, bow down, I, Shomu, issued an edict far and wide, directing each province in the realm to construct a temple of golden light and a temple of the lotus. These are the names of the monasteries and nunneries. The monasteries are the temples of golden light. The temples of the lotus are the nunneries, the Hokkeiji. However, the various provincial governors, now these guys, these slackers that I'm going to talk about in a second, these are the guys appointed from the capital. However, the various provincial governors have procrastinated and not carried it out. Procrastination is an age-old problem. Some of the temple sites are not well suited, right? They don't know where to build the temples, right? Because they don't know the local conditions. Some of the temple sites are not well suited. Others have still not yet started construction. How can my trusted advisors be like this? I asked them to do it nicely. Didn't do it. Then it goes on and then it says also. And then he tells the provincial officials basically to get their act together. And then he says also, appoint district officials who have courage and skill and can assist in various matters and put them completely in charge. If they can follow these imperial orders and build the temples as planned, then their descendants will receive appointments as district officials in perpetuity. So here we can see then that the provincial governors couldn't get it done, they failed to do the job, and they turned then to local knowledge, local power, the district officials. These people, these district officials, I should stress, are in most cases the same people that were building the first stage temples a few decades earlier. In this edict, moreover, these local officials were promised appointments forever for their descendants, right? Jobs. How do you get people to join on your project? You give them jobs, right? And you promise their kids get jobs. And that then incentivized their participation. When we look at the archaeological records, we can see this too. And we can see this most clearly at this temple, Musashi. This is present-day Tokyo. So this is another kind of reconstruction. You can see, again, this pagoda is like Harima outside. It's really far away. It's 250 meters from here to here. So it's actually, I mean, yeah, more than 2 football fields for American football fans away. It's a massive. So the scale of this compound and of the Golden Hall like rivals temples in the capital in terms of how big the buildings are. It's a really impressive structure. And this is just the layout here. Another weird quirk of this one is it has 2 dormitories running perpendicular. It's the only site that has this type of a layout. Another example of this kind of unique layout. But what's really interesting about Musashi is we have lots and lots of inscribed roof tiles that have been found there. And these inscribed roof tiles, as pictured here, are from every single district in Musashi. You can see some of these, it's actually pretty hard to see here. Some of these were done with like a stamp, and some of them were inscribed with like a stylus, which means you have to do it when the clay is still soft. You have to do it on site before you fire the clay. So these are all being fired, we know, at 2 kilns that are relatively close to the Kokubunji, to the temple, which is here in Tama district, Tamagun, Tama no Kori. But people seem to be sending resources to sponsor those tiles and then adding their name, their district name, to the tiles that they sponsored. So these were sponsored by the Tama district. These were sponsored from the Kudai district, of these various districts. As an archaeologist named Suda explains, 2 kilns were used near the Kokubunji, and the cooperation from district officials who would have sponsored the tiles at these 2 kilns seems to have been limited initially. But it picks up. We start to see these names from around 747. So from around the time of that edict, we start to see this district participation. The timing of this transition then implies that the district officials responded to the edict by mobilizing resources for the temples, perhaps with their eyes on promotions and appointments for the descendants. So this is a project envisioned by the state, but one that had particular rewards for local actors to be involved in, and one that local actors participated in to reap these rewards. So to wrap up stage 2, I've tried to show that the Kokubunji were unlike anything that had come before. They were massive temples with large numbers of monks and nuns, towering pagodas, centers of regular rituals ordered by the state. But I've also tried to highlight how they too required cooperation from local actors, who had their own objectives and rewards for participating in the project. If the first stage then was driven by local actors who required support from the court, the second stage was spearheaded by a state that still very much needed help from people on the ground, the same figures who led the earlier construction. Both cases, however, show how Buddhism spread and how it cannot be understood solely and simplistically as a state project, which is another kind of historiographical narrative we have of this period, is that everything is state Buddhism. Everything's just a product of the state. Local actors, too, had agency, even in state projects. All right, let's go to the third stage. So if you read English scholarship, most English scholarship will tell you about the Kokubunji. That's pretty well known. Some English scholarship will mention very briefly the first stage. There's nothing in English that I know whatsoever on this third stage. But I have to acknowledge drawing heavily from Japanese scholars, particularly archaeologists, but recently some historians like Yoshikawa Shinji has turned to this. They don't quite use this periodization of stages the way I do, but the types of things I'm describing in the stage is very much indebted to Japanese archaeologists. So as I told you at the beginning of the talk, we have this number 3,700 plus in Ennin's diary. 838 is when this conversation was supposed to take place. Yoshikawa Shinji has proposed that this number is based on the number of legally defined townships in Japan at this time. So how many townships were there in Japan at this time? There were about 3,700 plus. And so what Yoshikawa Sensei says is what Ennin, or Ensai actually, Ensai is the person that answers this question, was basically kind of in his head doing a quick calculation. Well, there's probably about a temple in every township or so. And so there's this many temples in Japan. That seems to be what his kind of calculation is based on, according to Yoshikawa Shinji. I find this to be a compelling reason. It's a weird number to just spit out 3,700, right? And so it seems like it's probably based on something, but he probably didn't know exactly how many temples there were. So he's probably kind of doing in his head, like, oh, I know how many towns there are in Japan. This is probably about one per town. I should say a town is a legal designation for a category. I'm going to talk about villages. There's a slight difference. There are multiple villages, often in a town, in a township. So a town is a census-based government kind of fiction that's created for tax collecting purposes. Sometimes will be composed of multiple hamlets or villages. I think hamlet is actually a pretty good word for what I'm describing, but if you look up hamlet in like Oxford English Dictionary, it's defined as like a village without a church, and so it becomes kind of oxymoronic to describe hamlet temples, so that's why I decided to use village temples. And it might fit the archaeological evidence. This is the case I'm going to try to make a little bit today, that it might fit the archaeological evidence, it might not. Since the 1980s, archaeologists have been identifying temples that they first called Sonraku Naijin and then started to call Sonraku-jin. The distinction between this I can get into in Q&A. It's a little bit technical. It doesn't matter that much for the purpose of my talk. These temples are surprising because they lack anything we would expect to see in a temple. They don't have pagodas, or we'll see, they don't have like pagodas that are taller than I am. Let me say that. That'll be my kind of keep you on your toes. They have, all the pagodas of these places are shorter than me. Maybe close to me, but yeah, I don't think any are quite as tall as I am, and I'm not that tall. These temples lack roof tiles, but what they have in common is an architectural pattern, which I'll show you in a minute, that's found at many of these sites, but not all, and most importantly, objects that are tied to Buddhist worship or that label the site as a temple. They're also open. They don't have walled compounds like all these other temples that we looked at so far. So they probably would have been accessible to people that were living in the area. There was nothing shutting them off. Originally, up until very recently, like up until like a decade ago or so, scholars thought this was a phenomenon entirely tied to Eastern Japan. The reason for this I'll get into now. I can't remember when I was supposed to do this in my script, but I'll say it now. So why were they found in Eastern Japan? This is actually really important. Most of the archaeology that happens in Japan is what's known as rescue archaeology. So this isn't when like you set out to be like there's a palace and a tomb and we want to excavate the site because it's like has historical importance. Rescue archaeology is when you're going to build a new building. So like I saw some construction in Stanford, I don't know what they're building. You're going to build that. Before you build it, you don't want to destroy the archaeological site underneath it. So archaeological teams have to come in quickly in like a month, do like a really quick survey, and then you can build stuff. So why Eastern Japan? So by law in Japan, you have to do these rescue archaeological excavations before you build any new construction. And more than 8,000 rescue archaeological projects happen in Japan every year. So it's like really, really, really common. Why Eastern Japan? Well, because that's where there was a boom of suburb growth after World War II, right? And so in the 70s and 80s, you have a boom of Tokyo's population and people in Chiba. This is why I keep returning to Chiba. A lot of population growth in Chiba, which means then that there's a lot of rescue archaeology in Chiba, and so you tend to find these structures. And what's important here is because they're not chosen as historically significant places to dig, they're just more randomly uncovered, you're much more likely to find things like random small villages that have that are not usually of interest to archaeologists, right? And so it actually, for the type of research I want to do, it's like the perfect type of archaeology. Although everyone always complains like, oh, they won't excavate the tombs. It's like, who cares about the tombs? This is the good stuff. But because of this, we have a lot found in Eastern Japan. Some of these seem to have been built, evidence for this is a little bit more speculative, but some of these seem to have been built by village collectives, and others were by like village leaders, like village chieftains or something like that, of both kinds. All right, so what do they look like? So this temple right here, this is obviously a modern reconstruction of a site known as Toterahara that had about 50, let me see, I have exact numbers here. I've lost my place in the talk already, but it was like 50-something, I feel like 51 pit structures have been found here, and 17 earth-fast post structures in the site as a whole. So you can see some kind of farming settlements up there, there's some farmland here, some other kind of pit houses that would extend down here. But this site here is the temple. And the calling card of these temples is this four-sided veranda. The building itself is nothing special. And that's what's kind of really interesting about it. It's probably with a thatch roof. It's earth-fast post-construction, which means you kind of dig a hole in the ground and put a post. And there were some roof tiles, but the roof tiles seem to have only been covering the ridgepole, not a tiled roof itself, which has a lot of weight and takes more engineering skill. So these are buildings that could be built using like local technologies and don't really require much expertise. But how do we know that this four-sided veranda is a temple, right? It just looks like somebody's got like a nice porch. Like I lived in the South for 7 years. Like it's great to have a porch where you can sit on your porch and like drink lemonade. Like maybe they wanted to sit on their porch and I don't know what, drink matcha or something. You know, that wouldn't have existed at this time here, but whatever. How do we know it's a temple? Well, here's where the archaeological evidence tells us it's probably a temple. For one, we've had 7, I believe. I always need to go back to my script for the numbers. I'm bad with numbers. I was talking earlier about how I can no longer help my son with Algebra 2 math homework. I also apparently can't remember any numbers as big as 7. 8 potsherds, 8 potsherds inscribed with the character temple found on this site. We've also found a monastic begging bowl here. We've found 3 pieces of pottery with sheen, which is probably a character for a monk or a nun's name, possibly, although we don't really know. But in addition to this, and I don't have good pictures of these, unfortunately, we've also found a number of bowls that were used in oil-burning rituals, which I'll show other bowls, not from the site in a minute, and a miniature clay pagoda, which I'll show another picture from a different site. I don't have a good picture of this place's clay pagoda. So we have all of these things that seem to be related to a Buddhist ritual culture. And in fact, those four-sided veranda sites often have had similar objects found near them. So what type of objects are we talking about? I'm just going to kind of walk you through them. So these are pottery shards from a different site. These are potsherds from a different site. But a lot of them you can see say temple, and a lot of others say sanbo, say the 3 jewels, right? This is the Buddha, the Buddha's teaching, the Dharma, and the Buddhist community, the Sangha. So it's probably offerings being made to the 3 jewels, which is something that you would be making an offering to. So these seem to be offering bowls used at these types of temples. Very occasionally, but rarely, we do find Buddhist images, like small-scale ones such as this. Far more commonly, we found these types of offering bowls. That's a variant character for tate matsuru, for to give, fung. You wouldn't really expect it that way. It looks almost like ben or hon, but it's actually a variant for tate matsuru, to offer. So these are offering bowls. We find a lot of bowls like this one that have blackened stains that people have done chemical analyses on and is used for burning oil. Surprisingly, in the provinces, some of these examples seem to be animal fat oil. In the capital, it's all vegetable oil, probably because animal fat oil is cheaper, even though it's not as good from a Buddhist ethical perspective. So we find these oil burning lamps. We find incense burners, very humble. I should say all of these objects, like earthenware objects, that can be made and fired very, very easily using local technologies. And then finally, these are the coolest ones, I think, miniature pagodas. So miniature pagodas and miniature halls, maybe Buddha halls, are often found at these sites. And I think the pagodas are really interesting. These have been found. I don't actually know how many. I'd like to do a short article on these at some point. But a lot of these have been found. These are commonly excavated at these sites. So all of these things tell us that this is a site of Buddhist practice in Buddhist worship. That it seems, given the architecture, right, when it's a relatively open space that anyone can kind of access, are being offered probably by lay people in the community around it in a site of Buddhist worship. What we don't have much, or sometimes we have very, very humble places of monastic residences, but we don't have the large-scale dormitories or lecture halls that we saw before. And based on some textual evidence that I'm going to have to kind of skip over today, it seems likely that monks or sometimes novices were traveling the countryside and would stay at these temples. And actually, in some cases, we have the name of the same monk at multiple village temple sites on pottery. So it seems like people were moving around, maybe staying there for a couple nights, performing some rituals, and then going on to the next place. But we probably didn't have like a permanent monastic clergy at most of these places. So as I said before, for a long time, people thought that these objects were limited to Eastern Japan. But more recent research, and this is just me summarizing some kind of things I've found in various Japanese articles, nobody's really synthesized this data yet. We found a number of possible examples in Kyushu. So one very confirmed, very clear, it looks kind of almost exactly like what we're finding here in terms of objects in Eastern Japan, here in this part of Kyushu. Very, very close right here. But a number of the proposed sites in this area, some possibly in what is Shimane Prefecture now today, and then some also in Mie Prefecture. And so we start to see patterns in lots of spaces. This is just like where Japanese people have proposed that there might have been one. Japanese scholars have proposed there might have been one. I made this map myself based on pottery So this is more of a macro level perspective, pottery inscribed with the character temple. Now this isn't a foolproof system because someone's name could be like Terasaki, and they could have that on a piece of pottery, right? And I didn't clean up the data to remove all of those. And a lot of times we don't know because we just have a fragment of it, and there might have been another piece, right? So this isn't completely foolproof. But altogether, there are 1,849 graphs with temple at 646 unique sites. Now, of course, not every site that we have confirmed as a temple has a piece of pottery that tells us it's a temple. There are others that have other clues, right? It might say sanbo, it might have architectural evidence, it might be roof tiles. So this isn't exhaustive, but 646 sites in Japan. And what's interesting is there's a lot of similarities actually in the distribution of these objects in this map and in this map. Surprisingly, we have almost no examples in this area here, which is surprising because this is a major highway in Japan known as the Sanyodo, where there are a ton of first stage temples. And this will be important in a second. Other areas we don't have temples are the brown spaces. Those are like really mountainous areas. This is an elevation map. So the brown is mountainous, and people don't live there in the past or in the present. Very densely in the eastern Japan for reasons that I've already kind of explained. We do have a little bit more on the Japan seaside up here, but very thin in southern Shikoku and southwestern Kyushu. And what I want to kind of propose as my theory, this is kind of my working theory, is that village temples are most likely to spring up in what I'm calling like a Goldilocks zone. Now this is a term from like astronomy for like planets that can support life, right? And so if it's like too hot, you know, or too cold, if you have liquid or you can't have liquid, right, like you can't support life or not. And so just like the story of Goldilocks and the three bears, you want the porridge that's like just right. And what does just right mean in this context? Well, areas that have no one living there or had very few Buddhist temples built in the first stage would have had few kind of connections to networks that would enable village temple construction. So places where, like this area of Shikoku, this area of Kyushu that tended to have few temples at the beginning, this area here tend to have few village temples as well. That's perhaps not surprising. But what's also interesting is, and I should say a lot of these ones around the capital are not village temples. These are other types of temples. But what's also surprising, this area that's really, really populated with temples that we know from first stage temples also doesn't seem to have a lot of this data. And what I want to suggest here is that we know, for example, in Harima, in Hyogo Prefecture, Harima Province, that there were already of first stage temples about one temple for every like 1 to 2 towns. So it was already pretty dense. So there's not really much of a reason to build like a humble, simple place of worship when you already have like a nice temple already nearby. And so I think these village temples are emerging in places that have some pre-existing connection to Buddhism through first stage temples and second stage temples. But they're not like overly dense already where you don't need to build something quite as humble. So that's kind of my working hypothesis. And I want to show you how these networks work to show you how these village temples in a lot of ways required or at least were closely connected to pre-existing temples. So we'll return to Chiba in an area of Ichihara district on the western shore of the Boso Peninsula. So this is like Tokyo here. I think Tokyo Disney is like right around here. I actually went to Tokyo Disney this summer with my kids, and we stayed at a hotel that was right there, and it was great because you could look and you could see the area that I've been studying. I've been to this area a lot here too, but it was neat to see it from the perspective of Disneyland. So this is a map I made of the temples. What's really interesting, a lot of archaeology has benefited from the construction of golf courses. And you can see these golf courses here. So a lot of times they got to do rescue archaeology before they build like the 18th hole, and then they find a village temple there, or a first stage temple there, of various kinds of temples. But I've color coded them. This is the highway. You can see the stations. And I want to just walk you through. I'm going to walk you through in a way that's like really, really fast. So I don't expect you to pay attention to all the details, but the overall picture that emerges is what I want you to focus on. All right. I need my script for this part. All right, so let's look at this microregion. I picked this area because it's reasonably well excavated and has a number of village temples. The story actually begins with a temple outside of our region. So it begins with a temple in neighboring Shimosa province. So it's going to be kind of north of where our slide is. northeast a little bit, this is a temple known as Ryukakuji. We can think of Ryukakuji as this area's Mirokuji, the temple I started with. This is a temple that, again, is built near burial mounds and a district office. And what's interesting that we see at Ryukakuji, that we also see at other places, is their roof tiles start to spread out to other local temples. So, for example, their roof tiles spread out to Kozenji, Imadomi, and Futsuka Ichiba. From there, the designs further spread with some slight modifications from Kozenji to Takeshi, and from Futsuka Ichiba to Kazusa Odera. And then Homeue Hararai tiles also seem to have been influenced by Ryukakuji designs. I got one click ahead, it looks like. The construction of the Kokubunji in the second stage, which is kind of pictured in gray, where it says Kazusa Kokubunji, this construction further enabled Buddhism's spread in the microregion under our study. Tiles using the same mold of the Kazusa Kokubunji have also been found at nearby Kozenji, where it's used for later repairs, and the Takeshi site. Oh, whoops. In addition, Kazusa Odera may have also used a mold in common with the Kazusa Kokubunji. For village temples, there are 7 clearly identified village temple sites in this microregion. These are all located within a 7-kilometer radius, to give you a sense of how big. We're talking about a pretty small area here. This is a 7-kilometer radius, so if we start in the middle, nothing's like further away from like 7 kilometers from like, you know, the third hole or whatever on this golf course. We earlier looked at To Terahara. Although I told you that the roof there was not fully tiled, there are a small number of tiles that are found there which are from the Kazusa Kokubunji pattern. The spindle designs of censer lids at To Terahara are, in my view, quite similar to those found at Haginohara, which is another village temple that's quite close. The archaeological report for another site known as Togodai mentions how the bowls unearthed there share traits with those at To Terahara. Some roof tiles found at the Togodai village temple's site, and the Togodai one actually did have a tiled roof. It's kind of unusual for these village temples. But these ones seem to be similar to those with Futsuka Ichiba, which itself was part of the Ryukakuji network. Haginohara and Togodai also have similar bowls that, very interestingly, have some sort of a siddham script on it, it looks like. That seems to be some sort of an incantation. Haginohara was also closely linked with other temples in the area, as evidenced by roof tiles found at the site that seem to have been brought from Futsuka Ichiba. Based on these tiles, Suda again speculates that the patron from Futsuka Ichiba may have developed land around Haginohara. Minami Ohiro, another site where a temple seems to have stood, shares objects kind of buried underneath the site, known as Chindangu, with Haginohara. Then we've got some other sites, Chigusayama Haiji, which has pots with the logograph for temple at it. There we see again roof tiles from Kazusa Kokubunji. And a final very poorly understood site known as the Mariatsu Haiji also seems to have common roof tiles with the Kazusa Kokubunji. So when you map this out, I mean, it looks like I'm crazy. This is like Homeland, you know, this is like Claire Danes and Homeland, you know. When mapped out, the constant connections between temples from different periods resemble a dense web, one that linked diverse sites. Notably, all 3 types of Buddhist institutions are interconnected: early provincial temples, Kokubunji, and village temples. In other words, the temples from these 3 phases collectively form what Damon Santola has termed wide bridges. As he argues, behavior spreads more rapidly when there are multiple points of reinforcing contact. So when you have lots of different things coming from contact, things tend to spread much faster based on kind of sociological research and kind of modeling than they do when you have like a bottleneck system at the beginning. So when you have this density, things tend to take hold faster. We can imagine, I think, 2 forces driving this construction of village temples. First, closer connections enable technological exchange and travel between sites. Once contact with the capital was no longer necessary, it was easier for villagers to access and exchange technology and encounter monks from neighboring sites. Second, the increased presence of temples created social pressure, causing villagers to desire their own temples to keep up with their neighbors. As temples became increasingly common, they may have also become increasingly desired. The spread of Buddhism to villages then was in part the result of this density and reinforcement through multiple inputs. Okay, I'll wrap up quickly. The final phase of temple construction then marked Buddhism's deep penetration into village life. By the mid-9th century, Buddhist places of worship were so common that Japanese monks like Ensai could reasonably estimate that the number of temples in Japan equaled the number of towns. By this time, at least, it seems the majority of villagers in Japan could likely walk to a site of worship, where they could participate in oil lamp ceremonies, make offerings to a Buddhist object of worship, and inscribe simple prayers for blessings. Altogether in this talk, I've tried to focus on 3 stages. The first were led by provincial elites who depended on connections to the capital for technological and material support. Second was the kokubunji, which were led by the royal family, but relied on local knowledge and power. And the third level saw these much humbler structures emerge. These too, however, were caught up in a dense web of construction, which enabled Buddhism to enter villages more directly. I speculated, and it is speculative, that village temples were most likely to emerge perhaps in Goldilocks zones, regions at once peripheral but not inaccessible. I hope that my analysis has shown that Buddhism, despite the common consensus, had spread widely. I also hope to show how this happened. Still, my discussion, which drew from the first 3 chapters of my book, has been decidedly incomplete. I've mostly ignored a number of important questions, right? Why did Buddhism appeal to patrons to begin with? How did they learn about Buddhist ideas and practices? To answer these questions would require that we attend to traveling preachers and their sermons, but that's a talk for another day, or perhaps a topic to be addressed in Q&A. I want to end here and thank you for your kind attention.